Namaskar and welcome to this exciting new episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. And today I have a very great friend of mine and a author of a of upcoming book. It's just been released on Amazon. And after the show, if you can buy that book, I'll be really happy. And and he has done amazing work over the years on specifically one area, which is Dharma, and given the popularity of yoga in North America, and also the concepts of dharma, especially the reincarnations, punarjanma, and karma, and so these topics have been very well accepted. Then why not let us debunk the something which has been grossly misunderstood? So with this book, this special friend of mine, I'm going to introduce his name shortly, has written this book on this topic. So I'm going to ask him all the hard questions because I know he can answer all of them. He's done all the research. And before we, and so let us, without delay, let us welcome Sri Pandit Satish Sharma from UK.
Pranamji, Om Guru Bhyo Namaha. How wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this. It's great to see you.
Amazing book, and the title itself looks so great. I think the book cover says it all, and I think viewers can see the book cover right behind him. And if you search on Amazon with the name Satish Sharma, then you'll definitely find it, because the name may not be immediately popular on Amazon so far right now. Maybe in few weeks' time, yes, it will be. So let us take first the challenges first. And since we talk about the Hindu community and also American Hindus, British Hindus, and global Hindu community, which is 1.3 billion strong or more, because more new converts we are not counting right now. So, what is the Hindu guilt on caste, and who induced it?
You have jumped right into the deep end, Adityaji, and it's as good a place as any. We will emerge into shallow waters as we talk. So this notion of this sense of guilt. Myself, by way of introduction, I've been in the United Kingdom for about 50 years now, and we have a third generation here.
You don't
Throughout
look
that
that old. You
period,
don't look that old at all.
oh, you are too kind. But throughout that period, we have contributed enormously to the British society and the community. We've contributed in every sphere. We have added the cuisine that our ancestors bequeathed to us. It's very popular here. And obviously you mentioned yoga and Ayurveda. All of these are incredibly uplifting, humanistic, complete sort of perspectives. But from time to time, you have a jarring experience where something is said or something is encountered, which makes you step back and think, that doesn't feel quite right. And that vulnerability I've traced is pretty much connected with the colonial tropes, the notions that the colonialists spread outside of India about Indians, about Hindus, about Dharma. Many of those are actually nothing more than colonialist tropes. And one of the most powerful ones is this notion of caste. So this sense of guilt, it manifests itself in a number of ways. I refer to it as the caste bomb. So you can be engaged in a wonderful gathering, let's say hypothetically an interfaith gathering, and you can be having a very pleasant conversation. And then all of a sudden, somebody will toss in the word caste, even though it may have nothing to do whatsoever with the conversation that's being discussed. And the Hindu in that meeting will suddenly be on the defensive. That Hindu will feel a sense of shame without having been personally guilty for anything. But instinctively, they will sense the spine will bow a little bit. It's almost like Arjunji in chapter 1, where he says, Hai hai ye kya hua, main kya karun, what shall I do? And at that moment, the Hindu is humiliated. It is an act of humiliation. And so what I decided to do was to try and reconcile. How did it happen? We have an incredibly inclusive worldview. We connect with Atma to Atma. We don't pay too much attention to the identities, nor to the outer coverings that Atma wears. And so, how on earth was it possible that, with such a foundation and such a perspective, how did we get to the stage where all of a sudden everybody is talking about a social structure which is by nature discriminative, which is by nature oppressive, which by nature seeks to humiliate a member of our own community and our own family, our own Hindu Indian family? So this was at the heart of what I needed to do. I thought, if as an act of service, if our generation can relieve the Hindu community and the Sanatani civilization of the burden of this subliminal guilt, then that would be a seva worth pursuing. That would be an action worth engaging in. And so that's what I set out to do.
It was very interesting. In this month in San Diego, we are celebrating the Black History Month, and also the Native American history and other history, which is connected with San Diego Black community usually.
Hmm. Hmm.
One word was mentioned there, the other backward caste. Now, the caste word was used in San Diego context. So, we all have discussed it many times. So, where does the word caste, if somebody asks me, where does the word caste come from? We all know it's a Portuguese word. But where does the connotation, when did the connotation became a Hindu centric?
Well, this is the domain of linguists, of people who are sensitive to nuance and to propaganda, to marketing, to publicity. People who know all of those things, they're the ones who, at this moment in time, I think, come into the front. Because the word caste, as you've mentioned, it's a two-dimensional word. It simply means class. In the Portuguese space, that's all it used to mean, class. And it would indicate a certain continuity of a breed. They would use it when talking about horses or when talking about creatures. And so it actually means nothing more than class. But if you take it into the Indian context and place it there, then all of a sudden what happens is that we now enter into the sphere of propaganda, because there is a whole subculture, a web of connected ideas, feelings, thoughts, reports, conversations which have been happening for so long, and all of them have focused on doing one thing, and that is developing a web such that the moment when the word caste is uttered, the person who is hearing it, if they are Hindu, will suddenly feel the deluge of negativity that's now attached to this hate brand. And if they're not Hindu, if they're perhaps an evangelical or a Christian missionary type of organization, they wield it to acquire strength in an engagement. And so it is much more than just the simple word which arose in Portuguese, was brought over by Vasco da Gama and his horde. It's a totally different entity now. It has gathered a life of its own. And one thing that I'm a bit concerned about, and which really propelled me to write this little book, was the appearance on the scene of Isabel Wilkerson's book, in which she has now brought caste into the mainstream consciousness of the United States. And the word and the thought, the idea, the baggage, the history that she has dragged into American consciousness, it demeans us and it harms us. And the tragedy is, for a Pulitzer Prize winner, I was devastated at the lack of research, at the lack of substance, and the lack of historical context in what she had written. Immensely disappointing. In fact, I've written it in the book that if you wanted to seek an ideal example of confirmation bias coupled with very poor quality research, you would find it in Isabel Wilkerson's book. It's tragically deficient, especially when dealing with such a sensitive, such an emotive issue as caste and its history.
You touched upon, again, you just gave me another question to ask you right now, which I had not prepared to ask earlier. So in so is the Pulitzer prizes and all these prizes have been given to people who have purposely worked against the Hindu culture? Many of the authors you see Pulitzer prize, is that the whole award is a conspiracy?
One has to look at evidence. We're researchers. We're people who look at facts and figures and occurrences and events. And when one takes those into account, there is a remarkable correlation that people who engage in supporting the history of the world according to colonialists are rewarded by the institutions that colonialists have established. And people who work towards undermining or correcting or putting a completely opposite perspective, they are very, very rarely given the platforms that are needed. So I'm not able to refute your supposition, and I would suggest that the evidence, although it's anecdotal and largely unempirical at this time, definitely supports that as a hypothesis.
So, in the title, one of the things which I was just reading the overview of a book which you sent me, one of the things was which occurred to me was, so when do you think the time frame in which this caste word was imposed on India? We all know the 1901 census in India by Herbert Hope Risley institutionalized seven types of caste, upper caste, according to him. So when do you think the officially this strategy came into their brains, or when did they start this propaganda?
So that is probably at the heart of the book that I'm putting forward. And you will see plastered right across the top, I've asserted, I've put a statement and it says the ancient Hindu caste system was in fact created and first deployed by Christianist missionaries on the 4th of January 1844. Now, I've chosen that date because it's the earliest record that I found, and it's a record which was written by the missionaries themselves, in which they identified two things. One is they identified that this thing they called caste was actually the only thing that was between Christ and the pagan, and that's using their language. In fact, I think it was Reverend Roberts who made that remark. The only thing betwixt Christ and the pagan is this wonderful Indian institution of caste. So that's where the phrase appears on the 4th of January 1844, and that was in Madras. The same gathering, I think there was a gathering of 33 missionary orders, and they had come together to have a conference in the same way that IT companies have conferences these days. They were having a conference on how to proliferate their ideology. And in that meeting, they discussed caste in detail as the word, as a concept, and what it referred to. And here is where the first conflation occurs. When they said caste, they actually referred to jati. And it's described in detail in the notes of that conference, where they are talking about artisans, they're talking about sons and daughters following in the footsteps of their parents with regard to transfer of knowledge. They remark how wonderful it was. They say that India had managed to get such a pinnacle of expertise and such a refinement of end product because of these mechanisms whereby skills were refined over generations. And knowledge that was acquired in one lifetime was passed over to the next generation at an early age. So they imbibed it, and then they could add further creativity to it and refine it even further. And if you have that mechanism in place after 3 or 4 generations, you have a peerless level of knowledge capital, of an indigenous knowledge capital. And they recognized that, and they identified it, and they stated it. So at that time, in 1844, caste was purely relating to jati, the occupational guilds, if you wish. Something then something then happened. In order to deconstruct jatis and to make the coherence, the fabric, the tight fabric of a community, to make it fray and to make it become weathered and thinner, they had to attack the deity that each jati would worship. Because with a multiplicity of deities, you will have the carpenters and the builders. They would worship Vishwakaram. Vishwakaram is the historically referred to as the architect of the gods. And so they had their own deity, they had their own practices for worshipping and meditating and contemplating upon the principles of that deity, and that added to the cohesiveness. So they had to erode that. Now, if you wanted to undermine the religion, you couldn't do it on the basis of jati. And so what they did is they thought, aha, we have these religious scriptures where they refer to varna. How about if we connect jatis to varnas, conflate them, call them castes, and denigrate the system? And that is where the strategy then, that's the direction it evolved into.
I mean, such a uh, inaptitude of these Western, the academics. I would say that, it's more like a propaganda machine than academics, and many of the academics are listening right now. So, my question to you is, though, so you identified the date on which this thing first appeared. Now, when was the scene where they actually say in English, like you all, denotation and connotation are two different aspects. So the connotation is extremely negative, and denotation is class. So so when you talk about, when they say caste, it's, I call it a caste allegation on the entire Hindu culture, demonizing it. So the demonization, and your book says so well, a colonial conspiracy. So what were they lacking, that they, and you partly answered it also, what were they lacking that they had to demean the entire Hindu community and the Vedic culture?
Well, the next element that I wanted to establish, you mentioned the word ineptitude. I wanted to know, was it ineptitude or was it malice?
Right.
Because if it was ineptitude, then the response would be a different response.
Right.
But if it was malice and there was an element of malice present, then I think we need to place that in context. And so, on that, let me share with you a note. Governor General Lord Canning, in 1857, only a decade or so after this conspiracy was hatched, he made the following, and I quote from his notes. He said, "As we must rule 150 millions of people by a handful, more or less small, of Englishmen, let us do it in the manner best calculated to leave them divided, and to inspire them with the greatest possible awe of our power, and with the least possible suspicion of our motives." Now, that seems to me to be a fairly clear stipulation, and this is coming from the Governor General. That sets, in my mind, the policy direction and the orientation. And if you take that into account, you take into account the other divide and rule principles that Lord Elphinstone, who was also very vocal, he spoke about, that it worked for the Romans and it should work for us in India. So if you take all of those sort of statements and orientations into account, we have a deliberate attempt to erode, deconstruct, and eventually destroy the cohesiveness of an ancient civilization. If you add to it then the comments made by the Anglicans, the missionaries at the time, you can see that they are following exactly the same civilizational impetus. So yes, I would assert that it was malice. Now, in terms of why did they do it, this is one of the tragedies of history. When you consider that we have a Euro-Christian civilization with its own value system, and they have gone out into the world, bearing in mind that the Euro-Christian supremacy, Christendom, shall we say, was established through violence. You know, we can't just overlook the witches in their ducking stools and the papal pear and other implements of horror and torture. We can't just overlook the auto da fe, the burning of Brahmins in Goa by Francis Xavier and his devout Catholics. If you take all of those into account, you understand the dilemma that was faced by the European Christians who arrived in India. On the one hand, they had built a Europe on the basis of violent imposition and blind adherence to beliefs. And then suddenly they arrive at a different place across the world, and here is a vibrant civilization. You know, the Soneki Chiriya, the bird, the golden goose, literally. And this civilization has accounts of its own identity, its own spirituality, its own paramparas and religiosity, which are vibrant, they're supportive of life, they're very life affirming, they're very ebullient. And yet they had established in the West a civilization which was life dominating. The heavy hand of the institutions of church were very, very present in terms of an oppressive society. So these people arrived in India. They had one of two choices, and in fact, those choices are the same even to this day. One was to embrace, here is an encounter with an incredible civilization. If we imbibe their civilizational drivers, just think of how humanity would leap forward. And there were traces of that. The Romanticists in Europe, if you have a look at the waves of appreciation of Indian knowledge which came into Europe, you can see it sort of increases and then suddenly something happens to diminish it, and then it increases again, and then something happens to diminish it, normally a world war or something along those lines. But if they had embraced the civilizational drivers of Bharat and the Vedic Dharmic civilizations, the whole of the world would have been in a different place to where it is now. But the cost of that would have been, and if I can use a Christian analogy, would have been the crucifixion of all of the false beliefs that they had built their dominance on. So, given those two choices, they chose to destroy Bharat and in that way protect the civilizational foundations that they had adopted. And that question, what do we do? At this point in time, I think the Christian establishment still faces exactly the same question. Because in every encounter with Indians and Sanatan Dharma and the Vedas and the Shastras and the Bhagavad Gita, the choice is still the same choice. Do we accept this? And in doing so, admit that actually we were not quite right with our ethos and our philosophies and own up? Do we do that? And I think really they should. It's a fundamental part of Christian law, isn't it, to express remorse, to repent, and then to make atonement. But that only works within the church. It doesn't work between the churches and the non-Christian world so far. But I think this is the crux of where we are at this moment in time. As more and more of their flock encounter dharmic principles, and the freedom of heart and mind that is enshrined in those dharmic principles, the more and more of the flock leave the flock. And so sooner or later, hopefully, enough momentum will be built up and people will revert back to genuine freedom of thought and freedom of heart and get to a stage where then Europe can actually pick up the threads of human evolution, that those threads that were so severely attacked and almost severed with the destruction of the pagan civilizations. So yes, I think it was an act of malice. I think it was done with colonial intent, and it was then covered up. Every effort has been made to cover up what was done. And it's still prevalent today. The Aryan invasion theory is part of the cover up. You know how that's been debunked, and yet look how prevalent it was. You know, for some reason, so many people around the world know the Aryan invasion theory. This is not an accident. For the same reason, so many people across every corner of the planet know about the Hindu caste system. Just think of how much else they could know about, right? They could know about Rasmalai, or they could know about some of the incredible dancers and so on. But no, the word, the meme, the propaganda, the hate brand caste has been proliferated across the planet, and that's why everybody knows about it. And I think it's about time we address this hate brand and repossess a much better way of doing things in terms of organizing society according to aptitude, which is what Varnashram Dharma is.
You made great points, and glad you put malice or the malicious intent. And I think the people who are listening this live or who will hear the recording must actually say, caste is not an Indian word. How can it be a Hindu caste system? It's a Portuguese caste system. So coming back to the point here, you said Sone ki chidiya. Again, I did a lot of research on that. It was a Persian term to encourage your own. They don't call it Sone ka sher because sher is not found in Persia. Sone ki chidiya is a Persian word. Chidiya is a Persian word. Sanskrit word is pakshi, Hindi word is pakshi.
Yes.
And just to say Sone ki chidiya so that you can easily crush them and you can easily control them. That was a point. Now, coming back to this caste thing, was it the church's insecurity that prompted this kind of malicious propaganda?
I think it was a combination of insecurity. It was certainly a combination of insecurity and fear. I think added to it was really a rapaciousness. If you remember the time, um, if I go back in 1859, there was an account of the meeting between European Christians and the Iroquois in the United States. And in fact, it was the chief of the Iroquois who coined the phrase about white men speak with forked tongue. And that was after, I think, they'd been invited to attend a peace conference, and 16 of them were slaughtered. So this is the same time frame that we're speaking about. We're speaking about um, pirates who became incredibly adventurous and effectively were given religious sanction to go and destroy and to appropriate and to enslave anywhere where Christianity hadn't set its feet. The papal bull, you will recall that the doctrine of discovery is now beginning to be spoken about much more openly, but only a decade ago, nobody really knew that the doctrine of discovery was the Pope giving official sanction and divine sanction to go and inflict human rights abuses on anybody and everybody who was not Christian. Now, the Anglicans weren't included in this, shall we say, this dividing of the world into two. This is probably the greatest imposition of a divide and rule policy, the papal bull of the doctrine of discovery. And at that time, the Portuguese and the Spanish were given authority to go and do this. The British at that time had no authority to go and do this, and so they took to piracy. They actually took to attacking the Portuguese and Spanish carriers of freight from the newly discovered worlds, as they called them. And so the British established their dominance on the sea in nothing other than rank piracy. And so when you see pirates acquire power, acquire wealth, acquire weaponry, and then set out across the world, the colonial time, the 1400 years, which culminated in 47 for India, 400 years under British colonialism, that colonial period is actually a time when pirates ruled the world. And we are now in the last stages of that period of darkness for the indigenous populations. Hopefully, that's now drawing to a close. What we're seeing is actually a world order, global institutions, which were all built on the shaky foundations of horrific global violence. And the Commonwealth is a great example. The Commonwealth is nothing more than a cover up. If you actually have a look at it, there was a tiny little island, England, which had no natural resources, and yet, by violence, managed to dominate Dharmic, harmless, harmonious civilizations in every corner of the world. And then, as they were removed, words are just so wonderful. Have a think about Indian independence. They granted independence. They were defeated by the INA. There was no way they could continue to dominate in India, and so they had to leave. But the manner of their departure was presented in such a way as to instill gratitude, as though they had given some sort of beneficence to the people of the colonies. And the Commonwealth was nothing other than an organization established to conceal that time. These things that were hidden are all becoming common knowledge now. And so the Euro-Christian hegemony is really what we are seeing being brought into question. All of the concepts about white privilege, white supremacy, they find their roots in colonial dialogues, and they haven't acknowledged that that's what happened. And until they do acknowledge it, we're going to see BLM, we're going to see all these voices. But in fact, in essence, those voices are demanding justice. They're demanding an acknowledgement of the horrors that were inflicted upon them. That's going to be, I think, that probably this decade will be the decade in which the choices will have to be made.
Europeans, historians, in their zeal for increasing their colonial powers, they destroyed the ancient history of South America,
Yes.
destroyed the ancient history of Native Americans. I mean, my heart goes out to such people, because the entire South American history is called mythology today, and in Wikipedia, and and church, the both Catholic Church, including Portuguese as well as Spaniards, both follow the Catholic Church. They have played a big role in completely removing the identity of billions. They tried their best, and they have succeeded in South America, where they were able to rule, but they could not succeed in Bharat because we had far more intelligent people than them, our saints and sadhus and other people. Is that the jealousy that prompted them to blame only Hindus for their Portuguese caste system?
Well, I think it's a combination of that, but there's also, let's look at it through the lens of a dharmic perspective. You know how we say that there are four purusharth, the purposes, the goals of a human existence, which you have to experience and transcend. And the first of those is kam, i.e., passions, and then there is arth, i.e., wealth, as it's translated, but it's the means for sustenance. And then a person moves beyond those two to dharma. And dharma is the search for harmony and tranquility, not just for an individual, but for everybody. It's to how do I exist and yet be in harmony with all of creation? That's the third stage of dharma. And when one has established themselves in a dharmic perspective, you acquire a state of moksha, an absence of desires. And so, if you have a civilization which is nothing more than a combination of all of the human beings within that society, if you have a civilization which is stuck in the first, i.e., calm, you have people wanting to experience sensory pleasure without end. If you add to it that desire for pleasures and it becomes fueled by a desire for earth, so you can fuel pleasures, then you have a society which is stuck in the first two. And like a human being stuck in the first two, there is misery, there is fear that you may lose everything that you have acquired, all of those psychoses which are typified by the Kuru Parivar in the Mahabharata. That's the civilization or the barbarianization which came to Bharat. They were stuck in the first two. They didn't have the equipment to recognize that there are dimensions such as dharma and moksha. They were completely absent from their mindset, their worldview, their understanding of existence. And so it would be a mistake to try and ascribe sort of a guilt from our point of view because they were completely unevolved and ignorant. But we have to recognize that there is still some shadow of that. And so our role, as I often say, that Hindus, we are civilized, we are society's civilizational impetus. Wherever we go, we introduce and try and establish civilization. We build civilizations. That's in our nature. That's our function and our role on this planet, to build dharmic civilizations. And what it was that we encountered an adharmic civilization, which was violent beyond our understanding. We could not recognize asuras and rakshasas in human form anymore. And so we basically crumbled. At that time in history, after 800 years of Islamist violence and atrocities, we really could not withstand the shock that came by a second wave of hatred and arrogance and pride and greed and hunger. And so, yes, we really did take a battering. But what's happened is, as we always do, because we build our existence in our society on dharma and satya, that which is real, that's what sustains us. And satya is built into every stone, dharma is built into every piece of creation, from flowers to human beings, the most complicated forms. And so if you're in alignment with dharma, it nourishes you, it replenishes you. And what we are seeing is a move of the dharmic civilizations moving from survival mode to, I think we're in revival mode now, and then hopefully we will get to thrival mode, where he says completely distorting the English language, but I will take poetic license with that one.
You In one of my articles that I wrote long back, and also called the first book, Dharma Commonwealth, where all the countries which profess to follow dharma, which is a like you just explained in a much beautiful way, very beautiful way, that dharma is the common sense, or it's a law of the world, prakriti. Now, and also it's the ultimate platform of happiness also, and which people who follow dharma, because most of the people who do yoga, actually they're trying to find themselves in a dharmic way, and trying to connect with their inner selves, and also becoming the most environmentally friendly people, because dharma induces that goodness in you. So now with that platform of ultimate goodness, and when you compare with elitist mindset, which is I'm better than you, therefore I'm going to tell you something. I often say dharma lets you find out yourself. And so nobody is telling you. Most of the Western societies are very much against people telling you what to do, people going to confess, which is in dharma. You don't need to confess, because Paramatma is right in your heart. You can always confess in the heart and then improve your actions. Self improvement mechanism. Do you think that's the insecurity, that they did not want people to become intelligent and think independently? So they thought that rather they should defame these group of people?
I think it's insecurity, but I think it's also fear. They recognize that you can't enslave Dharmic people for long.
Correct.
In order to enslave somebody, especially if you're going to enslave them without them even suspecting it, you need to radicalize them, you need to cripple their sense of wisdom, you need to instill guilt into their heart, and you create a particular sort of a psychosis in a person, that that person is always fearful and guilty. And this typifies a person who is enslaved. I think it was Goethe who said that none are enslaved more than those who do not know they are enslaved.
Correct.
And so, if you've built a civilizational model on enslaving people, and you encounter a civilizational model which says, actually, you don't need an intermediary between yourself and divinity, that all you have to do is sit still. Right? This whole earth has been created for your entertainment, enjoyment, delight, custodianship, all of the good things. And all you need to do is to be still and become harmonious. That's a massive civilizational threat to an institution and a society which is built on oppression and domination of the human form. So, yes, it was, and I'm absolutely certain it was, and they recognized it, and it is, and they recognize it. In fact, the reason, the impetus behind me publishing this book is purely and solely because it hasn't stopped. The desire to colonize us, the desire to put those shackles into our hearts and around the ankles of our intellect is still very present. And because it was leveraged and deployed against us in the United Kingdom, it started in 2013, it escalated in 2016, and that denigration exercise had started here in the United Kingdom. And so we challenged it successfully and managed to defeat legislation which would have branded us as being racist by birth. And because we managed to defeat it, I had felt that that's our objective done. We need tranquility and we need harmony. And so I had no intention of publishing the notes and the history and the research that we compiled until Isabel Wilkerson wrote her book. And when I heard that Oprah had sent 500 copies of it to all the CEOs, I thought all of the work that we have been doing to undo caste consciousness and revert back to the more fluid Varna Jati Kul Baradri Parampara sort of system, a multi-dimensional, fluid, harmonious flow of human beings through a learning life. When I saw that book, Caste, had been proliferated, I thought this is going to establish in people's minds an assumption that Hindus are casteist, and that's what we're talking about, and let's all talk about it. And so I felt, no, because we managed to produce the information and the research which undermined that initiative here in the United Kingdom, I thought, right, let me publish what I did and what we did, and bring it to bear, and hopefully it will be of help in restoring a sense of guilt-free harmony in the US as well.
It brings to you brought another point, and we discussed in the past as well. So race in Hindi can be jati, because race is a anthropological term, race. But caste cannot be jati, because caste is itself a class. So
Oh,
so how they like the, it's like a Sanskrit mistranslatable here. So how can they connect? How did they, what was the conspiracy behind connecting race to caste here?
okay. So we have now stepped into a linguistic minefield. Okay. Um, we don't acknowledge, we have no equivalent for the word race. Okay, race was a concept created again by Euro Christians in America in order to separate the lower classes, as they called them, the poor Irish, the poor Europeans, and the poor African American community. They were actually working together very well, and the concept of race was architected to separate them. Prior to that, it hadn't existed. And when you think of the Dharmic perspective, we have this word manushya, and it's come into mankind and man, and that means mind. So manushya is of the mind. So we are a species who have who have some aspect to us which other species don't have, and that's our mental faculties. And in that definition of manushya, that's the whole world. That is all of humanity is of one family. Vasudeva Kutumbakam is a commonly touted maxim that we have, but that is in essence what it means, and it couldn't be any other way. When you accept your family as being related by Atma, and that this coating is merely a temporary garment that we wear from time to time, and we change it according to the experience set that we have yet to traverse. If you accept that perspective, we have no concept of race. Now, the term of caste is actually very clearly defined in law, in term and in studies where people have spoken of this, and it's hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous. A society which is hereditary, hierarchical, and which marries within its classes is a caste-based society. And that is exactly what existed in Europe at the time when the European Christians set off out into the wider world. They didn't recognize that it was possible for human beings to be assessed or better understood according to their gunas, their aptitude, which is what we had managed in Dharmic civilization in Bharat. And so we don't have any equivalent of caste because the notion is nonsensical. And yet those for whom that notion was ideal, they needed to impose it upon Bharat in order to denigrate it. And I've often asked people who support this caste theory, especially when it's applied to Bharat, I say, okay, so what's the parameter, what's the metric that you use to define a high caste and a low caste? Right? Because you need a measurement. If you're saying somebody is higher than somebody else, I want to know what are the units of that measurement. Of the 560 plus principalities that existed when the British arrived, 400 were ruled by Shudra rulers. And yet when they left, the greatest landowners in Bharat were actually the church. So the largest transfer of assets moved from the Shudra community to the church, but the highest threat to the missionary movement and to the colonialists was in fact the educated people. And because they were the higher threat, that is the only metric whereby they can be banded as a high caste. And a low caste were those who were the least threat. That is consistently the one metric which applies in all uses of that word caste. So high measures the threat level to the Anglican missionary movement, and low measures the threat level to the same colonialist movement. No other metric measures. It's not in terms of power, not in terms of wealth, not in terms of land ownership, not in terms of armies or anything like that. There is no metric except threat to the colonialists. And I think as this history start to become revealed and discussed more and more, we will find that a huge number of the educated groups they were actually the largest victims in terms of death and in terms of killings that occurred in colonialist times.
You know, you there's a joke in Africa. They say earlier we had the land, they had the Bible, and they say now we have the Bible and they have the land. Today, that's the condition of the entire African continent today. So you're absolutely right, because the political capture, uh, by showing or demeaning the local cultures, and then land capture, and then destroying the economy. uh, you know More and more Americans, they identify themselves as spiritual now, rather than the any of these denominational church designations. And more Americans are gradually identifying themselves as agnostic, because they are tired of being told. And one of the things they are being told is the concept of that if you do not give money to me, then you are not a godly person. And how does that connect with this colonial conspiracy?
It's part of the enslavement psyche, isn't it? In fact, it's probably worth mentioning that the colonialists were always looking to create the lowest caste wherever they went. And they always created themselves as the highest caste in that society. So the white European Christian British colonialists, they became the highest caste in India, and they ran India according to the horrors that they ascribed to the caste system. That's exactly what they did, and they do that in everywhere that they have been. I think one thing that is really worth emphasizing also is that everybody knew that this is what they were doing. I'm Middleton, who was in charge of a census in M.L. Middleton. He was in charge of a census in the Northwest Frontier. And he actually, the 1911 census, he actually made a remark, and this is written in his notes. We pigeonholed everyone by caste, and if we could not find a true caste for them, we labeled them with the name of hereditary occupation. We deplore the caste system and its effect on social and economic problems, but we are largely responsible for the system we deplore. So this is a complete admission of guilt. He knew exactly what was being done in the name of this particular institution, and never once did they actually try and reverse the harm that was being done. And this was symptomatic of their escapades all over the world. There was never any attempt for reparation, restitution, or recognition of the harm that they had done. It's an extraordinary element of history. I think there's one last thing that's probably worth mentioning while we were talking about Varnashram Dharma and Jatis and things like this. There are only four Varna. There is no such thing as an untouchable Varna or an untouchable class. And so as part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to establish, where did this group of the downtrodden and crushed actually come from? In early accounts, if you look at the accounts that the Greeks did, the Chinese produced, and the Persian traders, the Middle Eastern traders, there is absolutely no evidence of the existence of an untouchable caste. So I wanted to know exactly how did that happen and where did it arise from. And there is an interesting development that occurred, and it was in 1871, so all about the same sort of time, where they were stamping out, the Anglicans were stamping out any resistance. And so they introduced something called a Criminal Tribes Act. And it's a fascinating piece of legislation. And it reflects the Christian ideology to a T, in that you can have, the assumption is that a person is born as part of a criminal tribe. They are destined to be criminals. They will live as criminals. They will die as criminals. And so you should act against them. Now, for us, one of the strange things about Christendom was this notion that you can be born a sinner, that you are guilty even before you occurred. And we thought, hang on, that's also criminal by birth, isn't it? So it's the same philosophy of religious institutions impressing upon people through force the notion that they are guilty of some transgression for which they actually have no recognition, no understanding. It's a completely insane concept. But the Criminal Tribes Act was viciously enforced. And the result of it, in 1947, when the British left. There were over 13 million Hindus who were effectively, they were confined in reservations or concentration camps on the outskirts of towns. And they're the ones who had been reduced to a subsistence level of existence. They were the tribes who put up the most resistance to the asset stripping that the British were doing. And by passing this act, the Criminal Tribes Act, basically the British legislators took upon themselves the authority to deprive anybody in a criminal tribe with a tick of a pen of all of their assets, all of their family relationships, their livelihood, and to limit them into tiny little confined areas around towns and villages and deprive them of livelihood as well. And that group, who were noble challengers to the domination of the Anglican British, that group were proud people, and they were diminished and crushed to become the untouchable classes who had no other sustenance other than scavenging and tanning and the dirtiest, most menial activities that can be done by a human being. That's all that was left to them. The whole of the untouchable class was created by the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act by the British.
And I think that law still continued in Australia, called Flora and Fauna Act.
Absolutely the same thing. Absolutely the same thing.
And the Native American Act also. In fact, Americans gave citizenship to Native Americans in 1924. So,
It's just appalling. And as I say, we were shocked. Some of these things are best left, the wounds are best left to heal. And humanity has an incredible capacity for reverting back to dharmic understandings and forgiveness and all of those sorts of things, if it's allowed to. So we were shocked that here we have in the House of Lords legislators, and you must remember in the House of Lords there are 26 bishops from the Church of England. We have legislators claiming that Hindus are doing this sort of stuff even to this day. They had no reason to ignite such friction in the community, and so we needed to address it. And as you've seen, the faculty of making mischief seems to be still very, very, very much prevalent in the US now, where everybody is talking about caste.
in the US, the most surprising thing to me is when somebody tells them a new child born is a born sinner. I think it's the most egregious, horrible, racist, anti-child comment anybody can make.
It is child abuse of the most pernicious kind. You
Exactly.
cripple that person's capacity to experience fearless love. You plant guilt into their hearts, and you cripple their faculty of reasoning because they don't understand. A child says, well, I've not done anything. How can I be guilty of something I haven't done? And if you have to accept something so unreasonable, your faculty of reasoning is also crippled.
What a discussion, and thank you, Pandit Satish Sharma. We will continue this discussion more. And for viewers, if you like this video, do comment on it. And for people who have watched it live, I would say that hear it again, because some things you may not have caught it, and do comment on it. So,
If
Pandit,
I could have one
please,
concluding word, I
please.
have very good friends amongst the Christian community. And so I shared the fruits of my research with a dear friend, and he read it, and he was horrified. And he was kind enough to write a note to me, which I've included in the book. And the essence of what he wrote is, if I can just read a little bit of what he wrote, I find it extraordinary that there are issues here of which until now I have had absolutely no knowledge. My feeling is that the majority of native Britons will share this reaction. And then he writes that the church and indeed the colonialists were able to afflict such violence on India. Between them, they were able to devise an extraordinarily successful divide and rule format which did immense damage to that country. Please forgive us now so that we can move forward together. Now, the subtitle of the book I chose as What Every Hindu and Christian Needs to Know About Caste. And that's because we have a huge number of Christian people, the vast majority, who are good people, struggling to make an understanding of what this journey called human life is about. And they are not guilty of these crimes that lie firmly in the past. And so our issue is with the institutions which became very wealthy and powerful on the back of these crimes, and who still seek to divide and rule all of us and prevent us from moving towards a dharmic understanding. And so my book is really, um, it's a message of actually hope and a way forward. And I think if we can have as many members of the Hindu family and of the Christian family read this, they will understand so much more about some of the source of the fault lines which we're all trying to work around and navigate at this moment in time. So please, it is a message of positive, forward-thinking progress and a vision and a perspective of that. So please do feel free to share it and to refer it to not just our Hindu family, but also to Christian friends and family who we can also start this dialogue with.
I share the same thought. Many people are not just aware of it, all these conspiracies, and I think with this video, they'll understand that there is a lot more to introspect and correct, and also force institutions to change. Because if it is not changing, then again we are into the bigger fault lines. And like you said in the past, in this discussion, the dharma is a platform for all, and loka samastu sukhino bhavantu, and it is the only platform where this discrimination can be avoided in all respects, either in thoughts or in words or in practice. So thank you, Pandit ji. It's always a pleasure.
It's
And
my
we'll be,
pleasure, and this, I'm honored to have the opportunity to address such a learned gathering. And I look forward to questions and indeed challenges. If there's anybody who feels that I've remarked on something or put forward a proposition which doesn't quite sort of suit what they understand, I'll be more than happy to engage and to explore this. So we're all learning and we're all unearthing, and only good can come of it. So thank you for the opportunity to address your audience.
do comment on the video with all the questions, and I'll be happy to pass it on. And also there'll be link for the book also in the comments, so do click on it and read it. Namaskar and thank you.
Om Tat Sat. Namaskar.